I extend a warm welcome to the members of the panel who are joining us here today. Mr. Akli Basada of the Tuareg people.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson, for the introduction. It is my great pleasure to co-moderate this panel discussion. We'd like to start with the first of the four panelists. This is Mr. Akli Shka Besada. He's from the Imuha International Organization for the Sake of Justice and Transparency. And Mr. Besada examines the situation of human rights violations of indigenous peoples, the Tuareg in Mali, Niger, Algeria, and Libya, and how this has affected peace, resolution, and instability in the whole region. So I'd like to invite Mr. Besada. You have the floor, sir.
Distinguished members of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, distinguished representatives of indigenous peoples of the world, brothers, sisters, friends from every part of the globe. I speak to you today on behalf of one particular very specific indigenous group, an essentially nomadic people found widely distributed around the Sahara Desert of northern Africa for many thousands of years. We are a people usually referred to as the Tuareg, although sometimes described in the plural as the Tuaregs. Neither term, however, comes from our own language, although for convenience and to be better understood, we are forced to use them. More specifically, I also speak on behalf of the Imuha International Organization for Justice and Transparency. Our collective concern derived from 100 years of unspeakable persecution and maltreatment that have occurred at different times right up to the present day, in a wide variety of places around our vast and ancient desert homeland. That homeland has now, alas, been parceled out into a number of new states, successors to former French or Italian colonies. Human rights violations committed against us have included mass killings and a great variety of other terrible atrocities. These have included torture as well as destruction and devastation, sometimes in a systematic way, of our very means of subsistence and our temporary or permanent settlements. As with other indigenous peoples, there are numerous stories that I could recount about the Tuareg today, to do with unprovoked conflicts that have ravaged our lands and our communities and resulted in massacres, rapes, other gross violations of human rights. Ladies and gentlemen, many such situations have gone unreported because they are repeatedly ignored by the mainstream media. They have frequently been pushed into political invisibility or else trivialized not only by hostile governments, but also by different non-state actors, including large corporations. Ladies and gentlemen, the Tuareg situation in Mali between 2012 and 2015. My people have struggled in Azawad for freedom and the right to self-governance with the successive governments of Mali, ever since the creation of that new and independent state, the so-called Mali 1960. The subsequent demarcation of borders left the Tuareg and the Amazigh people with no place whatever to call their own. The original inhabitants of the area instead found themselves totally ignored, but with their ancient and traditional lands divided randomly between four very artificially newly created countries. I refer here to Libya, Algeria, Niger, and Mali. The 2012 for the Tuareg was one of the worst years ever for war crimes. Crimes not only in Mali, but throughout the whole region. Ladies and gentlemen, the case of the indigenous Tuareg in Libya. The situation of the Tuareg population within Libya took a turn for worse with the fall of the Gaddafi regime, Hundreds of Tuareg were subsequently arrested, tortured, and killed, and others were imprisoned once recognized and identified. This happened in Tripoli, Misrata, Al Zawiya, Ghadames, and elsewhere. Today, more than 23,000 Tuareg in Libya have been denied Libyan nationality and normal identity documents, as a result of which their children have been deprived of schooling due to their lack of the so-called national number, or الرقم الوطني in Arabic. Ladies and gentlemen, what about the situation of indigenous peoples of Tuareg, the Amazigh people extraction in Algeria? The situation of the Amazigh and Tuareg people in Algeria can be described as not only very worrying, but worse than that. Dozens of them have been arrested and detained without trial entirely because of their ethnic identity. Most of the detainees are nomads, cattle herders, and in most cases, neither family members nor close friends are allowed to visit them. Prisoners do not have access to legal aid. On the April 4th, 2016, the Algerian authorities demolished 100 houses in Tamanrasset in the far south without any prior notice to the population. The Algerian authorities have never provided a copy or shown evidence that existence of the decision to knock down the Tuareg houses on the heads of the inhabitants. Ladies and gentlemen, what about the situation of the Tuareg people in Niger? The situation of the Tuareg in Niger is fantastically difficult. The state of Niger is not meeting genuine requirements of indigenous people, particularly when it is to do with land and environment. This can be seen clearly in the Greenpeace report and other human rights reports. According to Greenpeace Report 2010 and other reliable reports, dozens if not hundreds of Tuareg nomads have died as a result of French nuclear giant Areva activities specializing in producing uranium and chemical materials in the region of Arlit and Akokan village. The area have seen, for the first time in the history, awkward disease since the arrival of the company in 1970. Ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, I wish only to stress the following recommendations. 1. The Malian government must comply with its promises set out in the peace deal agreement with the Azawad people signed it in June 2015 in Algeria. 2. The African Commission on Human Rights and Working Group of the African Commission for Indigenous Peoples have an important role to play at the level of Africa and at the level of the countries of the Sahel for protection of the Tuaregs and indigenous peoples. 3. The permanent forum can play a role to make proposals to the government in the area of conflict resolutions, and above all, to find a binding mechanism that will obligate states, binding that will make states implement the Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples. But above all resolutions of the United Nations on the World Conference of Indigenous Peoples. 4. The governments must comply with international legislation to protect indigenous peoples, as it is stipulated in the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights of Indigenous Peoples and by the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples. 5. Countries must no longer be allowed to get away with mayhem without proper punishment. 6. The UN must put more pressure on member states, including Mali, on the Azawad people, to the Sahara region to end discrimination, marginalization, and the persecution of the Tuareg in territories that, all in honesty, must be recognized as having been essentially theirs for many thousands of years. 7. The Tuareg right to a national and documentation of an identity that combines it must be granted to the Tuareg of Libya without a delay, in a full accordance with the United Nations Declaration on the rights of indigenous peoples. 8. The indigenous peoples of the Sahara, the Tuareg, the Amazigh, could happily and usefully play an important role in any attempt to bring peace and stability to the region if only they are given enough trust by the governments of different states in the region. Thank you.